Thank you so much. So one thing, Erin is not as a technologist, so we're going to try this share screen and get everything going, but apologies if this takes me a second. Uh-oh. Let's see. All right. Is it sharing?
I don't. All right, there we go.
Is it? Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Trying to go into present. Do you see the menu bar? I think you see the menu bar now.
No, I don't see a menu bar.
Oh, you just see the presentation?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. All right. Well, then we'll just.
You were just hovering over an X and like your desktop, so it was fine.
Okay, perfect. All righty. Thanks for the patience. Okay, so getting started. How do we keep doing but do differently? Brought to us by Mid-America Arts Alliance. Thank you so much for you both and the Engage program for giving me an opportunity to talk about this. A little bit more about myself. I'm the person naturally that sticks out in this photo. I am an impact architect. And the way I describe that is I help people build blueprints for translating their visions, their ideas into the life-changing projects, programs, and initiatives. And in doing that, I'm also what I would like to call an undercover attorney. I am still licensed to practice and do still actively practice, though that isn't the preeminent side of the work that I do. And so my practice in general combines legal with design, with strategy. And so if someone comes in with an idea, helping them get past blocks, translating the impact, building it up, then actually creating the thing, project, program, initiative through legal tools, and then designing it for community embedment and furthering their impact. All my clients are community centered, which I love, especially having come out of a totally different industry when I was a corporate attorney for several years. And it's all informed by nature and culture, more specifically nomadic culture, which you'll see. And the reason for that is, with nature, it's been around for billions of years. I think there's a lot that we can learn from it. And we see it replicated regardless of whether it's intentional or not in many of our systems. And so rather than being unconscious about that, I choose to be conscious when I'm helping clients design things. And then both nature and nomadism, I see them as something that's incredibly flexible and adaptive, which, as we'll talk about, is really important for what's happening right now. Today's map, I'm going to start with where we are, then stabilizing, experimentation, what it is to do differently. We'll talk through some personal challenge and then questions. So really the workshop is in the personal challenges, but what I'm thinking I may end up doing is, in looking at my notes, just kind of taking some time throughout to challenge you to think about ways in which you can implement some of the things that I'm talking about. We'll have more concerted time toward the end, and then I'll take questions. But if somebody wants me to work through a particular challenge with them in front of everyone, if there's a brave soul, I'm happy to do that too. I'm pretty fluid when it comes to things like that. First, it's really hard this work requires a lot of creativity and depth. And it's really hard to do this work when we're toggling between Instagram and Bumble notices and email notifications. So I always say invest the time, if you can, which most of us can, for the hour and a half, just turn off notifications and fully invest in this time with yourself to allow yourself to go a little bit deeper than you may otherwise do when you're bouncing between several different fires. Also, I'm a big person about getting really centered. So if we just take a few seconds to sit and become aware of our breathing, maybe feel any tension we have. Some of us, it may be all throughout our bodies with everything that's going on, but just kind of really centering to where we are now, feeling our feet on the ground, if we have them on the ground, feeling our seats seated, but just bringing yourself to right now. And I did want to acknowledge for a second and take a moment of silence for Ahmaud Arbery, which you all may have heard about. Lots of communities shook by that. And so instead of a land acknowledgement, thought that I'd just give a few seconds of silence to what's happened there. So where we are kind of segues into where I wanted to start. A lot of people say, you know, Dag Erin, do we really have to start here, especially talking about something that is so prevalent for us right now and pretty heavy. But the reason I bring this up is because there is a lot of gaslighting and messages that are swirling around that are just not helpful. You're supposed to rest, hydrate, write a book, learn a new language, create a new symphony, be the most productive you've ever been, all at the same time while bumping up your emergency savings and surviving. It's not possible, right? And so as we start talking about the work right now in terms of how to do and do differently, you may be feeling anxious, you may be feeling sad, you may be feeling angry. It all makes sense. And there's a tendency when doing this work to think about, how do I do this work right? And I think right has gone out of, well, social distancing is right, but outside of that, right has gone outside the window. So it's super important for me to acknowledge this of you, and that I'm not familiar with each of your circumstances. And so I may be saying things and you may be thinking, she's got to be kidding. All of this is take what works for you, leave the rest. There may be phases that you're at where it may be helpful. It may be a phase that's further down from where you're at right now. Please don't feel inclined to implement everything that I'm talking about the way that I'm talking about it. And please don't feel inclined to do that with any of the advice that anybody's giving you, because this really is a difficult time. And one thing I like to tell people is, as you're doing this work, well, I'll talk about that in a second. Let's see. Oh, and make sure that you're moving, make sure that you're acknowledging your feeling. If you have blocks as you're doing this work, then acknowledge that as well. It may be that you move slowly as you start to implement new things. That works too, right? There is no right way of doing this. And so to that end, I always tell clients to integrate, don't segregate. One of the things that happens pretty often, especially I've noticed with my artistic clients, is that there is capacity building or discussions around strategy, and we co-opt the personalities of the people that are giving these talks, of the experts, and we try to implement in a way in which they would implement. But the crux of my work is helping people do their work as themselves, using their stories, their trials, triumphs, tribulations. And it sounds pretty straightforward, but how many of us have thought a specific way, acted a specific way, made specific decisions because someone else told us that's how we should do it, or that was the legitimate way of doing it, or not thought a specific way and acted a specific way. And I was reminded of that this weekend in talking to a client. So as you navigate strategy, implementing new ways of being, finding your new normal, please integrate the things that make you you, and involve your craft in everything you do, not just in your craft. And that means integrating your passions, your hobbies, your interests, etc., because this is what's going to help you navigate the discomfort. This is what's going to help you navigate the uncertainty, but it's also what's going to allow you to have some of the most amazing creative ahas. It's just by finding ways, and I don't mean just in terms of your branding and your marketing. I'm talking about the ways that you're approaching your finances. If you're a dancer, how is it that you can approach your finances with the same fluidity, with the same maybe precision, with the same quirkiness in choreography? How can you apply your craft to the way that you're evolving things with your business model, with engagement, etc.? So find ways to integrate, don't segregate. Then moving into stabilization, a note on why this is important. When we start talking about doing differently, we've got to have a solid ground from which to springboard. The last thing that you want to do is be on shaky, unstable ground, trying to move into something new. I think of it the same way I think of an injury. That may have been, that's the only analogy I could think of right now. But when someone has suffered an injury, we don't start shaking the leg and throwing them around. We find ways to stabilize them so that their critical systems can get to an equilibrium, so that their body can resettle. And from there, we can start talking about what needs to happen to get them back to a place of recovery. So similarly, thinking about how can we stabilize your organizations right now, not to keep you at that level, but just enough to springboard you into what recovery looks like for you during this time. Biggest thing on everyone's mind is money. How do I make more money? Especially as the funding landscapes have changed. Understandably, I think a lot of us saw this with Harvey. It's probably 3 times more now, and then you have the shelters in place. So people aren't spending the way that they would have otherwise have spent. When I talk about deconstruct and reconstruct the business model, it really what I'm getting at is deconstruct what it is that you do and your value add so that you can iterate on new ways to bring in revenue. And I'm not just talking about those that present as non-charitable businesses. Nonprofits are businesses. So this applies across the board. And I know that sometimes that language can make nonprofits uncomfortable. You will be fine. So don't just look at the business, again, what you are, and try to brainstorm. A lot of people have sat down and said, okay, money isn't coming in the way that it used to. What can I do to bring in more money? What can I do? It can be helpful sometimes, but a lot of times I find that much pressure and trying to brainstorm from just cold out of the blue, it creates blocks, especially because I find in Houston, there are very specific ways in which donors and funders and sometimes supporters expect your organizations to present. And consequent to that, there's very specific ways they expect you to make money. I am a dance company, I present, I sell tickets, I bring money. I am a opera, I present, I sell tickets, I bring in money. And so when we try to brainstorm cold, it allows us to come up against blocks, especially when we come up against how we've anchored in the traditional ways of making money in our respective businesses and organizations. So don't just look at the business and try to brainstorm. If we're an orchestra and we need to make more money, how can we deconstruct and think about what all we do? There's engagement, there's collaboration. I've seen some orchestras start to turn to education, seeing that as a big component of what they do. They're doing master classes, they're doing music lessons. If an artist isn't able to exhibit, can they share small postcards of their work under a subscription fee? It is still presentation, it just may not be presentation in the most traditional sense. Can they have longtime supporters commission work for outdoor spaces, for balconies, for porches, for windows, as we start talking about homes that are beautifying in their neighborhoods for the shelter in place? Can galleries and artists work with local businesses and corporations to capture some of the beautiful mind maps and manifestos and encouraging reminders that they have? Can artists set up markets and affiliates and sell under a model like that, an equitable counter to Amazon? Can they cross-sell with other artists? Can a sculpturist create a piece that deconstructs and then gets sent to me and I'm able to easily reconstruct the sculptural piece? I mean, there's a number of different things, but what's important is we can't center just on what we do. We have to deconstruct it to really think about what is the value behind it? Why do we do it? What are the different components of it? And from there, we can brainstorm different iterations, different versions of that accommodate our new reality, if that makes sense. You do have to be thinking about unrelated business income, especially if the way that you choose to bring in revenue now doesn't necessarily further the mission. It's not that you cannot make unrelated business income, which is often the myth. It's that you need to track it. It can jeopardize if it becomes too much. But all you would do is you would file a schedule and you would pay taxes on that. And I don't think that's a bad thing if you're bringing in more revenue. So be deconstructing and reconstructing your business model. So think about new ways in which you can be bringing about revenue. And for those who are saying, well, Erin, how do I deconstruct? That can start with just revisiting your why. It can be thinking about spinoffs of products and services that you currently offer. Sometimes it can be helpful to brainstorm new customers that exist, especially since we have everyone staying at home, and developing journey maps for them. So there's a number of different ways, but I just wanted to mention that because I know that's top of mind for everyone. Something else people want to do to stabilize is start thinking about how are we going to reimagine re-engagement, and this applies across the board. The tendency, especially because many organizations didn't have a digital presence beforehand, is just throw everything on a digital platform, on a webinar, or on a quick video stream and call it a day. But now is a time to really build a new kind of community, and it requires an intention and thoughtfulness for accommodating. How do we translate communing? How do we translate connection? How do we translate inspiration on a digital platform? Or how do we translate that in a way that allows for social distancing? Because I think a lot of people have gotten digital out right now. And so what are ways that we can be out in a way that is respectful of social distancing, but still allows for those same precepts to come across? This also requires the deconstruction I talked about. So really thinking about who are we and what do we do, deconstructing that, and then evolving that into new ways that allow us to engage. And so it's not a matter of how do I translate dance to this new circumstance? How do I translate the way dance was in February to May? It's about what is dance now in May. Right? It's a little bit different. What is dance now in this new environment? What does that look like? How does that feel? How do people engage with that? Because I think if you try to translate what you've done to right now, there's going to inherently be this disconnect and this tension, and you're going to be missing out on a lot of opportunities, not just in terms of revenue, but in terms of engagement. I wrote a post actually on this about reimagining re-engagement with the Houston Public Library as an example. And one of the things I said is, when I think library, I don't just think books. I think connection. I think information. I think empathy. I think dialogue. And so one of the things I suggested is, why wouldn't the Houston Public Library system serve as an addendum or appendage to 311? You know, if it's a COVID specific question, if it's a resource that we need, if it's some type of knowledge about it that we need, why wouldn't I be able to call the library and have them give me that information? And then the library can contract with the city revenue stream in order to do that. And then ironically, the Nonprofit Quarterly reported about a library about 2 weeks ago that is actually doing that for their city. They've been contracted, so there's a revenue stream to be an appendage to their 311, especially since they're community embedded. And so now they're answering COVID-specific questions for the community and connecting different community resources, which I think is amazing. What else did I have on this? And then internally, when it comes to HR, when you talk about re-engagement, what does it look like to cultivate a culture? What does it look like to assuage people's concerns without creating liability for yourselves? Something I've been telling a lot of clients is to be really careful, because in an effort to assuage guilt and to reassure everyone, some leaders are making promises or saying things, I would never, we'll do our best, we're going to do everything we can to avoid. That starts to create some liability for the organization. And so what does it mean to acknowledge what your employees, your staff, your stakeholders, your volunteers, your artists are going through without creating more liability for the organization? And what does it look like to do all of this work transparently? What does it look like to educate and bring your stakeholders, donors, funders in on this experience of, hey, we don't have all the answers. We're shifting. We'd love your input, and we'd love you to take this journey with us. I know that transparency is often seen as something that can be dangerous, because if we make mistakes, then people may not want to fund us. And there may be some funders for which that is the case. I'm not saying it isn't. However, I have seen organizations who have just been really vulnerable with their donors and supporters recently, and people have come out through woodworks in terms of helping them and giving them a little bit of grace as they bump around to figure out what does our new normal look like. So be thinking about that. And then also on the HR front, before I forget, be looking into things like Texas WorkShare and other programs that allow for the artists, for the employees, for the freelancers to keep working. To that end, because I know keeping everyone working is something that's on everyone's mind. Oh, it hit it. be thinking about cooperatives, collectives, and collaborations. What's going to get us through this is working together. And I don't necessarily mean that in the kumbaya perspective. When you talk about cutting your costs, you can absolutely do that through a cooperative, a purchasing cooperative. If you've got several of you that come together and there's a license that you want to buy for a specific virtual program or a license for a specific program in general, that's a cost that can be split. And then similarly for artists and presenting organizations, is it a selling cooperative? So are we starting a cooperative so that we can come together and share the costs of marketing and ads and things like that and then also cross-selling one another's products and services as a cooperative? Or is it just a collective around a specific issue? We have the COVID collective collaborative that's going on right now with several arts organizations. Is it just something very issue specific that we're working around to gather information, to share resources? Because a lot of what you all may be needing isn't necessarily money per se, but it just may be equipment and access to networks, to environments, to spaces. And so is that something that we can do through a collective or collaboration? Yeah, and maybe also a way to upskill. And then I've been telling a lot of people, be thinking about what are the fundamentals, because again, when we get to a point of disorientation, we can start to really laser focus on things that aren't a priority to the organization, but it's something that we feel we have control over. Facebook ads and different things like that aren't necessarily a priority, but it's something easy for us to focus in on when we start to feel like we've gotten a loss of control. Same with newsletters and things like that. Each of you may have your own thing that you tend to focus on, but really distill down to what are the fundamental things that I need to prioritize to make sure that my organization is stable, and prioritize those, right? I'm not saying that you should do everything for everyone, but that to that end, also don't leave people behind. Make sure to educate your environments as you're stabilizing. Like I said earlier, it allows people to give you grace, and you can be crowdsourcing ideas. That's another thing I haven't seen a ton of people do that I think is incredibly helpful, especially when you're talking about folks that have different perspectives. It's just what do you think dance looks like for us? How do you want to engage with us, knowing that these are the things? You could have a word cloud. These are the things that we see representative. Do you see words missing? Same could be the case for someone who does pottery or something like that. So educate your environment, keep them involved. Skipping along because I want to make sure we get done on time, respectful of everybody's time. So doing differently, before we talk about how are you going to do differently, we've just finished with how do we stabilize, thinking about our business model and rejigging that, focusing on our priority areas in terms of our food, water, and shelter, thinking about how do we work together to try to stabilize as well. Moving into different, keep in mind, different will be different for each one of you. And I am very aware of that. So what may be different over here and that someone may share may not be the same over here. Again, that's totally fine. What I would say is do be strategic, because what's happening is a lot of people are, they had things to do that were going along. March hit, there was a pause, and now they're going about doing the thing that they were doing before again. This is an opportunity. That wrench has been put in the gears. This is an opportunity. I am reticent to use that word because I know it may not feel like an opportunity for all of you, but it's an opportunity to think, is this a chance for us to pivot? A lot of arts organizations or art presenting cultural organizations I talk to often talk about shackles that they feel have been put on them by the funders, by their donors, sometimes even by their supporters and audiences in terms of what they look like and how they have to present, especially when they've been doing that for so long. And the interesting thing about when we've been disoriented and shaken up is that it removes those barriers. And so is this a chance for us to pivot into something that we've been thinking about for a significant amount of time? Is this a chance to rethink? Are we still going to be able to accomplish our mission? Should we wind down and revisit what we're doing? Should we be revisiting, maybe we should be doing something a little bit different, especially now that the environment has changed, maybe our impact is going to need to change. So what I'm saying is, rather than doing differently, doing what you've done differently, it may be different for you, it's just different entirely. And that's fine. not failure, it's evolution. So take this time to be really thinking about what the next step should be and not necessarily just charging forward with what you've done before. Especially if you felt like something was always off, there was always something that you want to do a little bit differently, but you didn't feel you had the permission from people or momentum, especially when you've been successful doing what you've always done, caught up. This may be an opportunity to break away from that and not be as penalized. Also pan out. Inevitably, when you shift to accommodate a new environment, you have to take a bigger view of who you are and what you do. Again, a dance company for me is not just a dance company. And what cultural organizations will have to think about is how do you fit into this new landscape and new needs? Because a narrative you might be hearing often, and being on many boards for arts organizations and working with many arts and cultural organizations, something that can come up is that, oh, that's a privilege. You know, that's a little frivolous. There's people over here that can't eat. We can't be worried about this. But I think that's, again, a very narrow view, and we have to pan out. So if I'm thinking about a dance company, I'm thinking about something that personifies collaboration, teamwork, precision. There's movement, adaptability, flexibility. And so imagine how important those skill sets are going to be for a service organization that's deploying their volunteers, who may need technical assistance in choreographing what's happening and having teamwork and allowing for adaptability and flexibility. Think about those corporations that have ergonomic focuses. I'm thinking about the Chevrons of the world that had their offices set up in such a way that ergonomics for their employees was important. And now their employees have been sitting at home in the same spot for a whole month. How important will that flexibility and adaptability, that movement be for corporations who want to make sure that the well-being of their employees is being kept top of mind, right? So just thinking a little bit bigger. That's what I meant by deconstructing and then reconstructing, because whereas you may not have saw the validity of what you do previously in one space, once you start to deconstruct, you can see the cross-pollination and cross-translations of the work, and that allows you to be creative. An opera company, could they work with a community to use their voice to process somatic trauma that they're suffering as a result of what's going on? I'm positive not only would there be arts and cultural funding for that, but there would also be social service funding that would be available as well. So by panning out, it allows cultural organizations to keep from becoming obsolete and being seen as art just for the sake of art, which I am not saying is a problem, because I wholeheartedly believe that arts and culture is going to be our way out of this. However, when we're talking about where can I look to for funding and what can I look to in terms of revenue, being able to cost translate what it is that you all do to the new environment and what our imminent needs right now, which is around processing the trauma with COVID, reintegrating people, workforce, and things of that nature, finding ways that you tie into that is going to be really important and open you up to new funding sources that you may not have otherwise seen available. And I tell that to all clients, you know, not to just be looking for the cultural grants, but how do we look at grants across the board? Because there's opportunity for cultural organizations to be working in business development. There's opportunities for them to be working in workforce. There's opportunities to be working in food and health. And there's no reason why those funding sources shouldn't be available to each of you, both as businesses, non-charitable businesses, and charitable businesses. And then I had other examples. There's galleries now that are working with communities, because you have a gallery curate community shows, showcase student work. I think there's a variety of different ways that organizations can pan out to find some, I hate to say relevancy in this, but you know, some connection to what's going on currently. And then I'm telling everybody, you know, avoid the shoulds, be a molecule, because again, there's a lot of people telling people how they should look and what they should be doing and how they should be focusing on it and how they should be presenting. And one of the things that I love about molecules is that I've been reading on, because I've been reading on this a lot, you know, they don't work to do, right? They bump around in a liquid. And then at some point, this part of a molecule is so attracted and connected to this one that they just connect and start to fold on to each other. And it creates a whole other thing unto itself. And so I'm going to talk about experimentation next, but be looking for opportunities to just explore and bump around so that you can attract that thing that folds onto itself and creates a whole other thing onto itself, right? And this could be talking to totally new audiences. It could be talking to totally new partners. Are there businesses or institutions, academics? Are there things that you haven't done before that you've been curious by, or thought, you know what, it may be interesting to explore into that? Are there spaces that we've never explored into? Opening yourself up to that serendipity is going to allow for that creativity. It's going to allow for those new revenue sources, and it's going to allow for you to be flexible in such a way that it's easier to navigate all the uncertainty that we have now with this new terrain. And I know that that can sound absurd in these types of environments when we talk about emergency, because there's so much focus on plan and rigidity, and we have to have it. But here's the thing about the plan. Did any of us plan for a global viral pandemic to shut down the world? I don't think we did. And so plans are great until they're not. And so I'm going to talk about frameworking a little bit later, but letting go of some of that and allowing a little bit of space as you stabilize, as you start thinking about doing differently, that's going to be part of the doing differently, right? Is creating space for those things and introducing novelty. Ways to allow for that space, as I just mentioned, is experimentation. That bumping around to allow things to fall into place. I won't spend too much time on this unless people say otherwise. I look at experimentation this way when I try to work with clients to create an experimental culture. It's interesting because we all learn this as kids and we talk about it a lot, but most of us are afraid to actually experiment with our organizations. I know firsthand that I often get afraid. I talk about this all day, and then when it comes time for me to use my own consulting services, I can struggle. But it's going to be super important. If you're talking about an environment that none of us really understand or know anything about, the only way that we're going to learn is by experimenting. And for me, doing that consciously and intentionally is far better than relying solely on bumping into, even though, as I mentioned, that's important. And so what I would say is, if you feel paralyzed, which I've heard a lot of people say, if you feel overwhelmed, a lot of that comes from putting pressure on ourselves to do the right thing, to have the right answer. You may be getting some of that from your boards, for those of you that are executive directors of nonprofit organizations. And the reason for that is boards can often fall into the traps of perfectionism and feeling we got to get this right, because if we don't get this right, everything falls apart. And this happens a lot with my artistic clients. The key to stabilizing yourself without necessarily falling into a coma is going to be evolution. And the key to evolution is going to be springboarding. And the way to do that is by exploring. What I love about experimentation is we can take action. When we start to take actions, we can form them as hypotheses, right? So rather than saying, I'm going to do X and then Y is going to happen and then we'll do Z, it's saying, I think if I do X, Y will happen. And then I think if Y happens, Z will happen. Here's why that's an important shift. If I'm so focused on it has to happen this way, X, Y, Z, it can take me a while to make a decision. I've seen this a lot with boards who take forever to make a decision. And again, that oftentimes lines up with their feeling like they have to make the right decision. Whereas if I take that pressure off and say, we're just experimenting, it's just a hypothesis. We're taking a guess that if we do Y, then X will happen. And if X, then Z, or X, then Y, and Y, and then Z. What that does is it allows us to go ahead and take action now, knowing no pressure. If that doesn't happen, that's just information, right? It's telling us that, okay, so maybe we need to be doing it this way, A into B and then B into C. So then we can start a new experiment. But it keeps me from mulling around and not making a decision. It also keeps me from doing the same old, same old. So if you're working to create a culture, actually I'll skip this and just go to designing an experiment. This is going to be your standard scientific method, right? So asking the question, the who, what, when, where, and why. What does it look like to engage our audience on a purely digital platform while maintaining our values of connection, belonging, etc. Doing a little bit of research, and so that may be on the different platforms. It may be on case studies. It may be on other evolutions of performance and going to different vehicles and modalities. And then creating the hypothesis. So the hypothesis may be, if I host this performance on X, then Y will happen. designing the experiment, testing it. It doesn't have to be gigantic, right? And I don't even recommend doing something gigantic in the very beginning. It may just be, if we reach out to people and say, we're offering this via this, we'll get 50% of them who agree to, or who sign up to attend, or whatever it is. But design the experiment, test it, then take the time to sit back, reflect, and analyze on it. This could be the case across the board. It's not just in terms of engagement. It could be your business model. If we do X, then we might have Y. It can be working with a new funder. It could be a number of different things, but my biggest suggestion, if it hasn't come across, is to make sure that you start doing experiments. They don't have to be experiments, but doing differently means doing differently, and different will come from exploration, experimenting, getting out there, trying new things. And I like to tell people about pioneer plants as we talk about this. It's something I've been reading about quite a bit. And so pioneer plants, they start in situations where there's been this major disruption, right? So there's been an eruption, there's been a fire, the landscape has just been charred. It looks like nothing will ever come back. Pioneer plants are the first in that succession. So they're what plants and creates an ecosystem that allows the second succession and the third succession to come about. And what's fascinating to me is that pioneer plants by nature are designed to do that. There's plants that actually, their seeds open up when there's fire. So when the fire occurs and there's heat, the heat triggers the seed pod and the seed automatically drops. So just as soon as the fire ends, that seed is already in the ground and about to sprout and plant and sprout. The way that the seeds carry in terms of the wind, the way that they're designed, the way that the plants are designed and where they're located, all of that allows for them to be the first on hand for when there's been something destructive that's happened. And I think that it's fair to say a lot of us feel like the ground under us has been charred to hell, which makes complete sense. And so it's gonna go, what's going to allow us to survive and thrive is designing ourselves to be something like these pioneer plants, right? Allowing us to be first on hand, to seed, to allow us to access the resources that we need, sun, et cetera, so that we can then grow. But I thought that was fascinating when I was talking to a client, because I think so many people believe that what's happening is happening to them. And yes, with uncertainty, there's a little bit of that. We can't control what's going on right now. And a lot of us are forgetting how much agency we have and ability to design. The pioneer plants, it's not that they just so happen to drop and something magical happens. They have been specifically engineered and designed for what they do. And so specifically engineering and designing our interventions in our organizations to be able to respond quickly and adaptively to what's happening is something that we can control. It's just a matter of, we won't have the absolute answer, and saying that we're going to be X is probably not advised right now, but saying we are X right now, growing, evolving, and iterating is going to be what's going to be most helpful. To that point, I think I've mentioned I'm not a fan of planning. And so to recap, we've talked about stabilizing. We've talked about how do I do differently? What does that look like in terms of doing differently, which may look different for each one of you. And so as you start thinking about, all right, Erin, how do I implement on doing differently? There's going to be that tendency to plan, which again, I get, because when we're in a place of not having control, the easiest thing to do is to try to act like we have control. And we do that with planning. And a lot of us are suffering losses from our previous strategic plans, some of which I know some of us finished just in February that have just been lit on fire. But I, again, am not a fan of planning because it doesn't build in time for reflection and it doesn't allow for agile movement. So actually, this is a methodology that I've come up with in terms of working with clients. But when I talk about frameworking forward, things that I want you to keep in mind, or the process that I would ask that you be thinking about, is look at your strategic plans. Do pull those out as they exist. They don't just necessarily just go away, but deconstruct, that word again, what's in your strategic plan to really get to the essence of why a specific action item was important. So if we said that we were going to grow our audience using a certain medium 500% or 100%, rather than throwing that away, especially if that medium isn't available, so maybe it was community meetings and you can't have community meetings, distill down to what the essence of that action was. The importance was either convening, communing, connecting, whatever it was, get down to that, because the how may have gone away, but the essence of it is something we can still center on and rebuild around. So deconstruct, distill down what you have in your strategic and your business plans to their essence, then evolve that into some sort of framework. So with a framework, what it does is you can list out what those big picture items are. Then you can list out your goals for those big picture items. So we want to create more community convening and connecting. We believe, hypothesis, framing that as a hypothesis, that we can create communing and convening by doing X, Y, and Z. And then to accomplish that, we're going to have our action items. So it's not as if you're leaving everything up to chance. There is still momentum in moving forward. But what's a little bit different about this is with a plan, we say X, Y, and Z. We do all the guesswork up front. Okay, I think this, and I think that, and I think this, and we make our assumptions, and then we move immediately into implementation. And think about how often have you actually sat on your strategic plan and reflected consistently on the actions that you were taking? Or do we wait till it either doesn't happen, or a year later, or our next strategic plan to say, oh, you know what, that wasn't working? And what I love about a framework is kind of like your car frame. It allows for a lot of flux and flexibility. It allows us to move so that if our hypothesis that we had wasn't correct, okay, well, I think that I can grow using Slack, then it's not as if that goes out the window. Then we say, okay, what's the new hypothesis? New action items, and we test from there. So it allows for an evolution that I don't believe strategic planning allows for. Now, I know a lot of boards and folks do that. Some funders even require seeing a copy of strategic plan. So I'm not saying it will go out the window entirely, but as you are planning your operations, I would suggest a framework instead. See if I missed anything. Something else that I love about frameworks is they allow for observation and curiosity. So if something isn't panning out, again, with a plan, I feel, at least for myself, I get attached to plans. So if I said I was going to do X, Y, and Z, I need to do X, Y, and Z. And it's a failure if I don't accomplish X, Y, and Z, which is not the case. It's information. And with a framework, what can happen is I can observe and be curious and say, we didn't do well on Facebook Live as I thought we would with this. It seemed like everyone else did, and we didn't do that well. Why is that? Then I can start looking at, with non-attachment, maybe it's the audience, they just don't respond. Maybe it was my marketing with Facebook Live. Maybe there's a timing thing. Maybe it's just some mediums do well on Facebook Live and others don't. Whatever it is, it allows me that space to be flexible and say, oh, you know what, it's not me or us or what we've done. It's just maybe we've missed something. Maybe this isn't for us, and maybe we need to come up with a new hypothesis. So one reason I'm a big fan of that. When you come up with your frameworks, shorten the timelines for implementation. So I know a lot of people do planning for a year, 5 years, sometimes 10 years. Who knows what's going to be going on in 10 years? I say every 3 months, be looking at your framework. So if you say, I'm going to focus on stabilizing my business model, and one of the things that I'm going to focus on doing differently is the ways in which we bring in revenue. And my hypotheses for ways that we can bring in revenue are X, Y, and Z. And my action items for each hypothesis are X, Y, and Z. Then after 3 months, take a look at that and start to observe. Again, be curious. What happened? What worked? What didn't work? What did you block on? Because it may be that just doesn't work for you. Or was it that you didn't have the resources? Was it that the environment doesn't allow for that right now? Start to ask questions and really reflect, and then tweak from there. But I love doing that every 3 months. I go no longer than 6 months. But that shorter timeline allows me to not go too long on a direction that doesn't necessarily fit for me, but get enough information to say, does this work? Does it not work? And then go from there. And then, like I said, make sure to reflect. That's one thing that strategic plans, I don't see a lot of reflection on what's happened, what worked, what didn't work, why didn't it work, what can we do moving forward, what came of this, all that information. I think frameworks allow for that. So I won't spend too much time on the methodology. I brought this up just because, again, flexibility in terms of how you reorient and do differently is going to be key. So if anyone wants a copy of this, I'm happy to send that to you. Also, I didn't mention it. If you want a copy, I have an earned revenue worksheet that I put together for clients that I'm happy to share. Just reach out to the ladies and let them know that that's something you're interested in, or I'll just email it to them and they can share it to whoever they want to share it with. Let's see, we're coming up on the hour, so I just wanted to share this. You know, a lot of people are talking about feeling like they're all over the place right now, and maybe even contradictory. I don't see that as necessarily being a problem. To me, contradiction is an indication of multifacetedness. You know, again, I think this is especially the case in Houston, and some of you may feel this way. A lot of folks have a very one-dimensional way of looking at our cultural and artistic organizations and believing if you do this, you need to just do this in this way and that manifestation. And if you do this, you just need to do this in that way and that manifestation. And I think what we are seeing now is the opportunity for our cultural organizations to blossom into a multitude, you know, into a multiplicity that hasn't been allowed before. So don't be discouraged by that. All right, I ran through that. Are we seeing any questions, or can I go into the workshop?
I do not see any questions unless folks have some. But no one has put anything in the chat box yet.
Okay, did anybody have any questions before I go into the workshop? Alrighty. So what I wanted to do is have some time for each of us to sit with maybe something that we're experiencing ourselves. And then we can answer any questions toward the end that may come up. Insofar as implementing what I've talked about, maybe it's just a question around how you're doing something and some suggestions we can crowdsource on as a group. But what I suggest just taking maybe 10 minutes with is choosing an existing challenge that you have so that we can see how to possibly implement on what I've just talked about in a way that may be helpful for you. It may not be. Again, take what works for you and leave the rest. But what I would suggest is choosing some challenge. It could be, how do we re-engage? How do we engage differently with an existing audience? How do we bring in additional revenue? How do we bring in new revenue? How do we tap into some of the additional funding and from a grants perspective that's coming in? It could be any number of things, but just choose challenge. And then what I would suggest is think about what's coming up for you around that challenge. Is it that I don't know enough answers? I don't have enough resources. I don't know who to talk to about it. But I'll give you just a minute or two to choose a challenge. If you want to share it, please feel free to share it. If not, which I totally get, you don't have to. And then also start brainstorming what's coming up for you around that challenge. And then we'll kind of walk through what I've just gone through very quickly, so you can get a sense of how all of that works. So I'll give you a minute to choose a challenge and then start brainstorming what's coming up around that challenge, maybe what some blocks are with the challenge. Some standard blocks to give you some ideas that I've heard people say is, I just don't know where to start. I don't feel like I have enough time. We don't have enough people. We don't have enough resources. And then once you've had your challenge, be thinking about how you can stabilize. And as a reminder, when we start talking about stabilization, we're thinking about what are new revenue sources that you can be thinking about? Are there collaboratives that you could be forming? Are there collectives that you could be forming? Are there ways that you can be keeping your artists and your freelancers at work? You know, is it a work share? Is it seconding them to other organizations? What else did we talk about? It's thinking about what your food, water, shelter is. What are the fundamental, most important things about what it is that you do, that you need to make sure that you have down packed before you move into trying to do differently? Or who do you need to educate? Are there funders that we need to educate about the challenges that you're coming up against? Is it other donors? Is it other organizations, partner organizations? Is it the city government? What are ways that we can stabilize right now to get that ground to where it's a little bit more stable, and we can springboard from that in terms of doing differently? So I'll give you a minute to think about how you stabilize. And then as you wrap that up, then what could you brainstorm as doing differently? This could be something that isn't working anymore. It could be something that you've always wanted to try, but just didn't know how. So again, if we're talking about, I want to bring in new revenue streams, it's different just actually building out revenue streams. I know that for a lot of nonprofit organizations in Houston, there's a reticency to build out earned income and a lot of dependency on grants and donations. So is that you're doing different? It's just we're going to build out some really conscious and substantive revenue sources. If you are a gallery or non-charitable business, is it we're going to target a whole new market in terms of our customers? But just brainstorming a couple different ways that different may look like for you based on your challenge. And remember, deconstructing here is really important. So if revenue is what we're thinking about, deconstructing who you are may allow for you to see different ways of going about that revenue. If I'm a presenting organization, what does presenting even mean? Presenting traditionally meant all of us gathering in one space, and sometimes it was a very one-dimensional, someone was presenting to us. Now there's an opportunity for a very dynamic way of presenting. What does that mean? And you don't have to have the answer, but is that something that you want to do differently? Do you just want to redefine what does presenting even mean for me? What does it mean for me to be a gallery? Does a gallery really have to be a space? What does it mean for me to create works of art that, in terms of my paintings or photography? It could be any number of things, but just kind of opening yourself up to that, I think, is going to be really important as we talk about doing different. So I'm blabbering because I know sometimes just brainstorming these things can be difficult, especially as we come across, lunch is coming up quickly. But hopefully it's helping in terms of thinking different. If it doesn't have to be profound, that's another thing people tend to get hung up on, is they try to do something profound and totally different. If different for you is we're just going to learn how to use these tech tools and be able to avail ourselves of the digital platform, go for it. That is your different. And then deconstructing who you are maybe will allow us to find creative ways for you to do that. But as you are wrapping up brainstorming different, what questions are coming up? Because I've noticed when most people get blocked, this is where they get blocked, are the questions, right? And because they don't have answers to the questions, it's like, and it just kind of gets put to the side. But I think it's helpful to just really get those out and about. So is the questions, okay, I don't know the legal around bringing in new revenue. I'm scared that we may not be in compliance. Will this upset our funders? Will it upset our donors? Will we lose tried people? Same, if I'm a gallery and I'm going to new audiences, will I lose the audience that I have? What does it look like to cater to those audiences? These could be a number of questions that are coming up, but list those questions, get that out so you see it, because all it's a matter of getting answers. And I think with the Engaged network, that's absolutely possible to get answers to a lot of the questions that I've seen coming up. So get those out. Again, these don't have to be profound questions. It could just be, like I said, a lot of questions I've been getting around doing differently is this illegal? People don't want to go to jail. Imagine that. So if that's the question, is this legal? Put that down. Am I going to get in trouble? Put that down. Because those are the things that are going to start blocking you up and keep you from taking action. So get those out on paper.
Erin, and if you like, this could be a part where we open up the video and people can unmute themselves and ask a question.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Should I do that, or can you do that?
Yeah, I think I can do it too.
Okay, I was going to say, I may cancel on all of us. So I don't want to touch anything. So as we're wrapping up questions that are coming up, this is where we can start to build our experiments. Okay, so we're looking at, okay, if a question of mine is, what does it look like to re-engage in a way that doesn't involve digital platforms? I can start building experiments around that. Does that mean working with a community and maybe it's just me on the street and they're watching from their homes? Does that mean not necessarily even having one out, but putting up satellites? So I've been talking to clients about satellite galleries. You know, what does it mean in terms of an experiment? And the experiment can be a low prototype. Rather than setting up a whole satellite, is it just putting up works of art from artists that you represent around town? And how does that work? You know, how do people enjoy that? If you create a map or an app or way for them to see the works of art, is that something that resonates with them? Is it not? So just think about a couple of different ways, a hypothesis. If I do this, then that you could experiment around. And what information, really centered around what information do I need to feel comfortable taking steps forward doing differently?
Catherine, did you have a question?
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes.
No, not necessarily. I'm thinking about our challenge coming up. We had a summer educational program planned originally, and before all this happened, to take place in June and July, involving high school students and students from Juilliard. So we're at the point now in trying to decide what's coming up for us is, do we do it? Do we not do it? Do we delay it? Or do we pivot somehow and reimagine how this kind of educational experience could take place?
Mm-hmm.
So we're trying to figure that out.
Is it a revenue source, or was?
Not really. I mean, we were just hoping to break even with it, so we had some funding to underwrite the cost of scholarships for students who are going to participate. But and we would have had performances at the end of it that we would have charged admission, but the goal wasn't really to make revenue, it was just to break even on the expenses of the program.
That makes sense. So what I usually tell clients in working with them in these situations, I think, do we or do we not creates a false binary for some people, and they can get kind of stuck in that block. What I always find helpful and fun is, what would this look like if? And so there's a couple different lateral thinking exercises, and I'm happy to talk offline with you in terms of what that looks like. But, you know, if, you know, the way I've seen it done is they choose something crazy. So if the craziest scenario, if we can't leave our homes, what would it look like to commune without leaving our, like, just coming up with different imaginary exercises and going from there. Because a lot of times, I said that the decisions whether or not to do programs can be heavy, and they get rooted in, well, we just don't see it being as possible. And if I can find ways to root clients in their imagination, oftentimes how doesn't become so important, because they're just so driven by the why and the vision that they have for what it could end up looking like. And so it may be helpful, rather than just seeing as a pivot, to say, let's just go crazy and brainstorm what this would look like if there were aliens that visited, or whatever the case may be. Have a couple of different prompts, and then end with the prompt of, if people are in their homes and we actually can't see each other, what would this look like? And just see what comes out of that. And it may be from that that you discover that it isn't a space right now, because there's just there isn't the space to iterate and imagine what that would look like. But you may come up with something really, really creative and cool that you wouldn't have come up with just thinking about, well, should we do it and should we not? Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, just kind of like the freedom to imagine what it would look like in the worst case
let people
scenario.
get crazy. And I tell you, I've done this with quite a few boards, and it is fascinating how creative boards, because I know sometimes it can be a bit drudge, but it's fascinating how creative they can get. And usually it's that one thing that looks like it could never have been possible, but if you tweak it, you're like, oh, that actually could be done. And so this is where deconstruction for you, I think, would be incredibly helpful too, is to just deconstruct what were the things about that program that were really, really important and the essence of that program for you. Because even though that how may not be available, that essence, if you center on it, there may be ways to evolve it that are. And then the way to figure out what that would look like is to do that imagination exercise and say, well, what of these match those essences and values that we came up with why this was important to us to begin with?
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
And then maybe if we can deconstruct it all the way to the end and still can't find a way to reconcile, at least we'll have that clarity, like we really dug
exactly. And then you don't have the pressure of saying, yeah, we should do it or we shouldn't do it, which I think can kind of, and sometimes we don't want to be that person to say, you know what, I don't think this is a good idea. But if we're looking at our board and we're just not really seeing what we need right now to creatively and enthusiastically push forward, which again makes complete sense in the middle of a pandemic, totally fine. Then we offset it. And that may be something that you revisit. You know, you do the exercise again, which I've done, and you look at your ideas versus where you're at. And you're like, you know what? I'm so glad we waited because look how much cooler our ideas are now. You know, you may just need time to marinate as an organization, which makes complete sense. Cool. And you may take this time to experiment too before I go off of that. So what you may say is, if we don't, even if we decide not to do it now, for us to get that information that we need and feel comfortable making a decision next time, what can we do now that will give us that information? Is it just sending out a survey, which I don't know if I would do a survey now because everybody's doing surveys, but you get what I'm saying. Is it reaching out to people and talking to them? Maybe it's a mini thing. So even if it's not a camp, is it an hour or two of just something experimental that you put out there and see how people respond and gather information that way? So I would definitely communicate to them. It doesn't have to be an either or. There's a spectrum of opportunity. And even if they don't necessarily do the program, they still may do an experiment that allows for you to have the comfort to do the program in a different way at another time.
Thanks. Yeah, that's really helpful.
No problem.
Framework for thinking.
And then to that end, you know, if you do decide to do it, then creating that framework of here are the hypotheses that we've come up with. Here are our goals with those hypotheses, and that could be attendance, reach, whatever. And then these are the action plans, and then playing with that.
Cool.
Did anybody else have a question before I? So to that, and I think Catherine gave us a great example. So, you know, looking at ways to experiment, what information you need, and then what does it look like to framework forward? So what are those hypotheses that you've come up with? What are some goals around those hypotheses that you've come up with in terms of if-then statements? And then what are the action items that you can take? And then setting some time in your calendar. I like to do it ahead of time. So just 3 months from now, what can you do to sit down and reflect on what's come of that? It doesn't have to be 3 months. It may be sooner than that. You know, in Catherine's case, it may be sooner based on what they end up doing and the timeline that's associated with that. But I always find it helpful to calendar in time to think about these things. So just a few minutes, if you haven't already, to think about what does it look like for frameworking. And if that doesn't, the frameworking I know is a new concept for some. So if it doesn't make sense, do let me know. And I'm happy to talk a little bit more about that, but just be thinking about ways, how do we keep from planning per se and put this more into a framework? And what does a framework look like for me? And then what are my next action steps going to be? I'll give you a minute before I wrap this on up for us. So as you think about frameworking, please keep in mind, these are some bigger concepts. The intention is not to have it to where you walk out of here with an absolute solution. I think that is the tricky bit about a lot of these presentations is people want to come out with something that's like, all right, got the answer. what's really important about this time is we don't have the answers. And so getting really comfortable with discomfort, first and foremost, is going to be key. But what I wanted to talk with you more than anything was about process, because I can give you an answer today that is going to be totally inapplicable tomorrow, especially with everything that's going on and not knowing where we're going to be at, 5, 10 months from now. But if you have a process, it's something that you can easily replicate. So even if the environment changes and the answers change, you're able to run this yourself and say, okay, let me run this again and see what applies for me right now. So that's something else I would caution to just be careful about, is that there's going to be a lot of people talking about things with certainty, but they were talking about things with certainty back in February. And what was applicable in February is absolutely not applicable right now. So, take care with that and really be thinking about, what is my process for accommodating the uncertainty and for evolving and iterating around the uncertainty is going to become, I think, really, really, really important. And so I wanted to open up, if anyone else had questions. I know we have a few more minutes left. Let me know. I know that I had a client ask me a question yesterday that was interesting, that I'm happy to share, but I want to open it up to anyone that may have questions right now. Are we all good? So one of the questions I got was around funders. What do I do when I start talking about frameworking and totally iterating? What do I do around funders that may not want me to go in that direction, who don't agree? One, I think funders have released a little bit of control from what I've seen. I'd be happy to know if there's not the case, and there's cases of people who are still willing a lot of control around how they think that your intervention should look. But from what I've seen with the calls, a lot of funders are saying, we don't know what the right answer is. And they're giving a lot of leeway to organizations. So I would absolutely take advantage of that. But something else that I would think really carefully about is your narrative around doing differently. So that was why I mentioned educating the environment. I wouldn't just start doing differently and allow everyone else to put the pieces together for you. I would go ahead, just as you would in any type of marketing campaign, have your narrative around why you're doing differently and why it's important that you have support as you're doing differently, and be communicating that to all your stakeholders. That's also in educating the environment why I think it's important that you be including your stakeholders in you doing differently. Because not only does it allow for them to have ownership and that community embeddedness that I had talked about, but again, I have seen some phenomenal things come out of crowdsourcing and just getting different perspectives across different domains. So if you think your funder is going to be a little bit not so happy about you doing something differently, whether that be revenue sources or engagement, not a problem. See about putting together a narrative and working with them closely and say, you know what? We totally understand there's concerns. How do we assuage those? Knowing that what we've done before doesn't apply in this current environment, and just reinstituting and reasserting your agency. Something else that I've gotten a question about was the revenue again. And as a nonprofit, people being concerned about developing new revenue sources. I mentioned this briefly, but just to reiterate, unrelated business income is something to be thinking about. However, most organizations do have revenue sources available to them that further their mission. That is not a problem. The whole concept of a nonprofit not making profit, I hope we all know, is a myth, and I don't know who is spreading that, but they need to stop. The hope is for you to all make as much profit as you possibly can so that we all thrive collectively and abundantly. And so if there are ways, one thing I didn't bring up, ways to think about bringing in more revenue more immediately, be thinking about your assets currently. Do you have equipment that people can use a fractional interest of? So the same way you think about like an Airbnb, do you have equipment that someone that may be able to rent, for a fractional interest? Do you have other assets that you don't use? I had a client that bought a school bus to transport, but she wasn't using it for 6 or 7 hours of the day. So we set up a way for her to have that was available as a rental to other arts organizations that she was working with. And it brought in actually a pretty significant amount of revenue. Again, that was pre-COVID, but just an example. She had an asset that was already purchased that was hers. She wasn't utilizing it. It was decaying and sitting for several hours a day. By using that, we were able to bring in revenue, and she actually created partnerships with some of the organizations that she'd been working with that she just didn't have a close relationship with. So is there an opportunity for that? Do you know people that people want access to? Do you have data or information that people would want access to? Do you have knowledge or expertise? This goes to that example with the dance company, who will have knowledge and expertise about movement and flexibility and adaptability, all things that corporations are consistently talking about with their team forces. So is there knowledge and expertise that you have that you can be leveraging to bring in more revenue as well? So there may be things that you're sitting on currently that you could be leveraging and just haven't, that could be furthering your mission. Now with the corporation, that may not further your mission, but that could further your mission, and you wouldn't have to worry about unrelated business income. But don't be afraid of those earned revenue sources. Those are going to be really important right now as funding and donations shift, until you can pan out and think about how you fit into the greater vision of COVID and response to COVID, whether that be short-term, medium-term, or long-term. Did anybody have any questions? Perfect. I'm assuming maybe, so everyone's marinating. I'm going to say everyone is marinating.
I think it really is the marination, which may not be a real word, but it is today. It may be, yeah, we're just in a marination phase, because I think what you've presented, is a challenge that may be easier for some than others, particularly if the way you process information is very linear.
Yeah.
It's like, how do you adapt this sort of like this type of thinking, or what you're also asking folks to do is take risks. This is adventurous risk taking that ultimately, though, no matter where you end up in the process, you are far more aware of the situation you find yourself in. And I think that is one of the most important lessons, is that what you've offered is for folks, a couple of rubrics for ways for folks just to take a minute, right? Instead of transitioning from one thing to the next, like this checklist, to really sort of sit in that list, or sit in the series of actions, or how you're thinking about, it's about value. What is it that you're valuing about why you do what you do? And how do you hold on to that whole value while the process in which you execute it and even create it may be completely different?
Absolutely.
And I think that's like, how do you have a question for that? Because now you need to go try it. So the good news is we have your contact information. I know that this presentation will be available, and I do not doubt that, in fact, I think we've already gotten a few emails of folks wanting to sort of talk to you, because now they're starting that process.
Oh, good. And
Right,
Kelly, you mentioned something that I think is really important to acknowledge. There is risk with this, and I know that for a number of reasons, that has been made into a bad word, and there is uncertainty. Right. Something to keep in mind is that there was always uncertainty. We were just led to believe that there wasn't. And so as we start to confront this uncertainty that's always been there, please do reach out to myself, to engage, to your community, to talk through that. Because it can be jarring, and it is something that's going to take a little bit of time to process.
Right, but the most important thing is that it's not impossible.
Absolutely.
And there's the level of failure is what we design as believe in failure, like, doesn't exist in this point. Like, it's just, okay, so how do we just re-envision this? How do we just do this differently? And these are the times that you can think about it, because the way that your day-to-day operations have shifted. So, you're not necessarily going anywhere. So it's about being deliberate and making the time to look at what you have, and, also takes a bit of vulnerability. But I think that we're about to see some really, really wonderful things. I personally am very excited. I'm very, very excited about how this will shift creative placemaking and creativity and programming and just the whole gamut of it. So, Erin, I wanted to thank you so much for sharing your plan and your wisdom. I think you're a wonderful combination of this sort of like very free range thinker and deep down really good list maker. I think that's what it looks like when it grows up and does a presentation like that. So thank you so much.
Thank you.